Goeiedag, het is 'n plesier om jou te verwelkom by Regheid met Robinson hier op Litnet. Swart ekonomiese bemagtiging, of SEB, is nie 'n keuse nie, maar 'n plig. So sê president Cyril Ramaphosa oor die aandrang deur verskeie partye en instansies dat swart ekonomiese bemagtiging hersien moet word. Dit is een van die ernstigste punte van verskil tussen die ANC en ander partye in die regering van nasionale eenheid. One of the institutions against the present Black Economic Empowerment Policy is the FW de Klerk Foundation. We welcome you, Ismail Joosub, Manager of the Constitutional Advancement Programs at the institution. President Cyril Ramaphosa said a day or two ago that BBBEE was a success. Do you agree?
Mr. Robinson, thank you for having me. We at the FW de Klerk Foundation frankly disagree with that statement. There is no way that we see BBBEE over the last 30 years as being a success.
So what is the problem?
Well, I think the best place for us to start is to look at the Constitution, and to look specifically at the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. We know that Section 9, which deals with equality, and Section 9.2 specifically allows for a narrowly tailored version to allow for affirmative action policies. And that says broadly that legislative and other measures must be designed to protect or advance people who've been previously disadvantaged. So I want to make it clear that the FW de Klerk Foundation stance is not against redress measures or transformation in general, but only against transformation policies that have strayed so far from the constitutional byline. And I have to say this, when you look at the Minister of Justice in the Van Heerden case, that case specifically says that when you have these redress measures, three things need to be dealt with, three requirements. And those are that they must target disadvantaged groups. Well, perhaps you can say BBBEE does that. It does target a specific racial group, but it must be designed to protect and advance that group, and also that it must promote the achievement of equality, and not just equality in general, but specifically substantive equality, Mr. Robinson. And when we look at substantive equality, we see that that is equality that does not come at the exclusion of any other racial group and does not create any new forms of inequality. BBBEE, as we see it at the FW de Klerk Foundation, has only served to benefit a small, politically connected elite. In fact, an argument can be made that instead of bridging the inequality gap, it's widened the inequality gap. It's made inequality worse. And also, what it's done is it's become a tool for political capitalism, for political cronyism. It has not met the constitutional standards, and it has strayed far from where we should be as a society.
Well, let's just get this straightened out of the way. Most people in South Africa do agree that there must be some transformation. Is that true?
Absolutely. We do agree that some form of redress is necessary. And when you look at the idea, or what we call the noble intention behind BBBEE, it makes sense to have some sort of redress policy. But the FW de Klerk Foundation takes a stance that this shouldn't be race-based, it should be meritorious, it should be merit-based. And we at the FW de Klerk Foundation have suggested a number of alternative proposals, like, for instance, equity equivalent programs, like ownership models, like investing in communities based on socio-economic need and not race. These would serve people better than a race-based measure that enforces rigid racial quotas.
I would like to come back to the models that you suggested, but in the meantime, could we just ask you, do you think that the work in the past 30 years has made any kind of difference financially to the plight of the poor in South Africa?
Absolutely not, Mr. Robinson. I mentioned earlier that what BBBEE has done is in fact widen the inequality gap. If you look at the stats, we see that unemployment is at its highest level ever. And we look at unemployment from the lens of the masses, the poor masses, especially if you look at unemployment through the lens of Black people, we see that it's far higher than what it should be, despite these so-called transformative measures. I also want to quote something by Professor William Gumede, who said that a trillion rand has been dispersed in BBBEE benefits over just 100 beneficiaries. That is not serving the poor and disadvantaged masses. The rich, politically connected elite will be fine. It's the people who need change, and BBBEE hasn't done anything to solve that.
But some of these beneficiaries were over and over and over rewarded. Is that true?
This is absolutely true. And I think it goes back to what I said about political cronyism and political capitalism. I think some of the other disadvantages of BEE are that apart from the rent-seeking mentality that it's done, the window shop mentality that it's done to give the appearance that some people are benefiting or that people, specifically one racial group, is benefiting when that isn't the case, what BEE has also done is it's become a front. We see what's called political fronting, the practice of falsely claiming BEE credentials. And this is one of the big problems with BEE, where you have these BEE score points that are given as per the codes of good practice by the Minister of Trade and Industry. And in search of more and better score points, many businesses bypass BEE laws, falsely claiming that they are in adherence with BEE codes to get BEE score points. What the government here has done is they've made BEE specifically necessary for state procurement.
And some people started shell companies to actually get contracts.
Yes, there are a number of companies. I will not name them specifically, but many of these companies do exist. And they exist specifically, as I said, because what the government has done is they've made redress a tick box exercise, simply to say that because we have a few companies on the top who have a 30% ownership in black hands, that now means that BE as a redress measure is working, when this isn't the case. When we come back to some of the alternative solutions that I propose, and I spoke about equity equivalent, we see how instead of giving away a portion of your company to a specific racial owner to meet a BEE score point, instead, companies can use that money to invest in communities, in things like skills development, in education, in infrastructure. All of these things are more necessary than the window dressing type of exercise that government has been trying to implement. And so a number of companies have benefited, in my view, very unethically, even though BEE hasn't been deemed specifically illegal. I think it's time for us to close the book on BEE.
Well, perhaps this is a very sensitive issue, but even the president himself benefited in the past because of this policy, the present policy.
This is true, and it goes back to what I said about BEE having been a nobly intentioned piece of legislation in the past. Had BEE worked, had BEE achieved all of its noble objectives from the outset when the BBBEE Act was passed in 2003, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in, Mr. Robinson. And it comes back to the question that you asked me earlier. Have we seen any tangible results change on the ground? And had we seen some tangible change on the ground, this conversation would be having a very different turn, with me saying, no, but the president has benefited and many, many others have benefited. We now stand in a situation where, yes, you're correct, the president has benefited, and some of his friends and political cadres have benefited. But the ordinary man on the street has not benefited, and that exactly is the problem. It's become a fig leaf for the enabling of state capture also. And I know that's very sensitive, but Mr. Zondo in his Zondo Commission had highlighted how these companies have become vehicles for the looting of the state.
What would you say is the core problem behind this whole problem that we have at the moment?
I think the core problem, not just being implementation, but I think another core problem around it is the constitutional soundness of BEE. But I think, just to give you a quite frank and straight up answer, this centralization, it seems, into the hands of the government, the consolidation to the government to determine who's in and who's out. It's not just something we see with BEE, Mr. Robinson. It's something we see with employment equity targets and rigid quotas as well, for the government to determine who you should employ on the basis of their skin color and who not. It's something we're now seeing with the transformation fund by the Minister of Trade and Industry as well, to determine which company should benefit on the basis of race, what those score points should be, what the ownership model should be. It's the government wanting to make these decisions on behalf of you. And this is why I say, let's move towards a model where companies have control over their own businesses, and through some sort of economic model that prioritizes socioeconomic need instead of race, yes, benefits the community, redresses previously disadvantaged individuals, but in a way that still retains the ownership model that makes businesses grow and thrive without adhering to these bogus race-rigid quotas.
Would you say part of the core of the problem is basically that we as South Africans haven't really made our mark as honest citizens of this country to make a contribution to the benefit of the poor and those who really need it?
I wouldn't blame anyone aside from the lawmakers who've put in these laws because the citizens of South Africa are incredibly resilient. And I think when I say citizens, I mean the private sector as well. When we look at the private sector and we look at the contributions that private citizens and indeed the private sector have made to uplifting the poor, it far outshines any initiative by government. And I want to give you an example of this. We know that Starlink right now is a big headline in the news. Look at the disadvantage of having BEE, where we make investment in South Africa so undesirable. Well, when we look at the Electronic Communications Act and how that bars Starlink from coming into South Africa as compared to other companies coming into South Africa, and because they are ICT companies like Google and Huawei, they do not need to adhere to the 30% ownership giveaway as per BEE codes of conduct. And those, Google and Huawei, have made tremendous contributions to the communities in which they are developing.
And Elon Musk is one of those who can invest in this country, but he didn't want to do so. Well, there's this absolute call that he must give up 30% of the company to South Africans.
Absolutely, that really is a reason, and I don't think it's a far stretch of the imagination to rather suggest and make a better suggestion, in fact, that instead of giving away 30% of Starlink to one specific black owner, 30% of which wouldn't benefit anybody on the ground, let's create a special economic zone whereby when Starlink invests in South Africa, they're investing in their communities, they're uplifting the people, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are being benefited by this great investment in South Africa.
This transformation fund that you spoke about, just give us an indication of how you think it can work, if not.
I don't think the transformation fund can work at all. I think the transformation fund, there are a number of, and we made a submission to Parliament on this as the FW de Klerk Foundation, and we raised a number of concerns with it. How it's envisaged to work, Mr. Robinson, is that you have one single pot funded by 20 billion rands over 5 years by voluntary contributions. And when companies put in contributions to this contribution fund, or the transformation fund rather, they get better BEE scores, and better BEE scores naturally generally translates to better procurement as per the state. Now, we have concerns with that for a number of reasons. Firstly, any money going into this transformation fund is outside of parliamentary rules because Parliament says, and the Constitution determines, that all money must be put into the National Revenue Fund. So it would be a para-parliamentary exercise on its own. But aside from that, how do the governance mechanisms of this transformation fund look like? Who sits on the board? What control does the minister have? Is this just another example of totalitarianism and centralization in government? Also, if you're giving away BEE score points for better preferential state procurement, then it just opens the door for it to become a feeding trough and open to abuse.
And then Parliament must actually be the watchdog for this fund. And they must do their work properly because Zondo indicated already that that wasn't done by Parliament in terms of some of the projects.
Exactly. What Chief Justice Zondo in his Zondo Commission stated was, or he highlighted a number of examples where SPVs, special purpose vehicles, have been used for abuse in the past. And I feel this is just another example of that. I'm very disheartened, and we at the foundation really are very disheartened, as you'd see from our submission to Parliament last week, that instead of government rethinking BEE in general, it's now doubled down on BEE as per this transformation fund. 100 billion rand could be put to much better use.
Do you think the stance taken by the president over the past few days was basically as a result of political pressure within his own party?
I think it's a very important question to ask. I think there are two answers to this question, and it's sort of a double-edged sword. I think the first thing is you're right, Mr. Robinson. There may have been some political pressure. There may have been pressure specifically from factions within the ANC, specifically what we know as the Radical Economic Transformation faction. And we know that people like Deputy President, maybe future President, Paul Mashatile has been in favor of that and in favor of BEE in general. And you, in your introduction, Mr. Robinson, said that Mr. Ramaphosa had also said that he believes that BEE is working. So certainly there's a political element to this. But I think also, and a more candid answer would be, we've got to follow the money path. And this is just another example of how those who benefited benefited from BEE to stay in power and wish to continue to stay in power because it benefits that small politically connected elite at the disadvantage of those who actually need redress.
Part of the problem, people say, is that we have race-based policies.
That is absolutely a problem. It is not progressive in any sense. It is regressive. Mr. Robinson, one of the major problems I personally have with BBBEE, with the Transformation Fund, with employment equity, is that it doesn't, none of these, introduce a sunset clause. When do these redress measures come to an end? Should it continue indefinitely? This is the question. But I would like to debunk a myth. There has been this myth going around that we have some 149 race-based laws in South Africa. Not all of those race-based laws certainly discriminate against specific racial groups. So when you have a law, for instance, if you have, for example, the Public Service Act that simply mentions redressing historical injustices by benefiting people of a certain gender or a certain race, then that in essence is not to the disadvantage of another racial group. But when we look at employment equity, when we look at BE, these are certainly race-based measures and certainly do harm to other racial groups by benefiting or by trying to benefit one racial group. And I want to go back to what I said in the intro about that Van Heerden case, that Constitutional Court judgment, which said that measures like this, measures of affirmative action, must be remedial, rational, and proportionate. Well, has BE been remedial? Has it remedied anything over 30 years? It hasn't. Has it been rational? Certainly it hasn't been rational, because if it hasn't benefited anyone over 30 years and you keep doing it over and over again, that's insanity. And has it been proportional? It certainly hasn't. R1 trillion over 100 beneficiaries, that's not proportional.
And then, according to the new proposals, the demographics of the country must be reflected in the measures taken.
Yeah, I want to go back to section 195 of the Constitution, Mr. Robinson, which speaks on the elements of public administration, how it should be governed, right? And you should have a public administration that's governed by the principles of economic efficiency and just overall competency, generally, broadly speaking. We at the FW de Klerk Foundation have no problem with broad representation, but this should be on a meritorious basis. We cannot be sidelining anybody of merit simply because we're trying to meet some tick box exercise so that we are quote unquote representative of the demographics of South Africa. This is going to lead to a brain drain, and it's going to cause South Africa to become a cadre state. I believe that it's not going to lead to any increased productivity, any increased efficiency. All that it's going to be doing is it's going to be leading to a single party or a few parties who lean that way to be trying to score political points at the expense of people's livelihoods. We cannot risk people's livelihoods in this regard. We cannot be creating laws that acts as total or complete barriers to employment. We must remember that one of the founding values of the Constitution is dignity. People have dignity once they have a job. If you were to put a racial quota on that, you destroy people's dignity, you destroy their livelihood for no other reason than trying to score political points. That's masked or disguised as redress when it isn't. It's blatantly rigid quotas.
Do you believe that there are specific places on the planet where these kind of measures do work?
I want to refer to, I'm very glad you asked that question, Mr. Robinson. I want to refer to Malaysia. Now, in Malaysia, they had an affirmative action measure called the Bumiputera system. And this system was very similar to BEE, and I tracked this very carefully and closely to see whether or not it's worked in Malaysia. Perhaps we're on the right track in South Africa. Maybe we are doing something right in South Africa. But when I did some investigation into Malaysia's affirmative action measures, I saw that it's failed completely. That in fact, in Malaysia, they too, as we are in South Africa, are trying to rethink how we can achieve more substantive equality. And then I looked at Malaysia's neighbor, Singapore, and I looked at what Singapore did. And Singapore, instead of going for a race-based system of redress, looked at a socioeconomic model of meritorious redress where people on merit are employed, where people who are indeed disadvantaged are benefited by companies investing in their communities through these various alternative solutions like employment shares, like economic zones, like equity programs. And look where Singapore is today. It's worked tremendously.
There has been calls for a national dialogue. Do you agree?
This and many others. There are many problems plaguing South Africa. I'm very glad that the FW de Klerk Foundation has played a very active role in the national dialogue. We sit on the steering committee, or what's been dubbed the preparatory task team of the national dialogue, which is the preeminent decision-making body of the national dialogue. And in this regard, we've had a number of interactions with the president's emissaries, which has now culminated in the president making his announcement endorsing the dialogue last night. I personally also serve as the co-chairperson of the public mobilization committee of the national dialogue. And my job really is to take the idea of the dialogue to the ground, to the people, 250 local municipalities, 88 districts, a number of metros, millions of South Africans to get together in dialogue format. And the question that has been asked is, what sort of conversations do we have, and how do we make sure that conversations are broadly inclusive, that no one's voices or views are left out? And I mentioned earlier that one of my jobs is to make sure that we facilitate dialogue and not filter dialogue. So any view on what's wrong in South Africa must be brought to the fore. And these touch a broad range of topics: land reform, for instance, service delivery, for instance, race relations, for instance, indeed economic disparities, unemployment amongst the youth, poverty, GBV and women, and as you mentioned, indeed, BE. To answer your question simply, I think this is a great chance for BEE, for affirmative action in general, be it with BE or with employment equity, to be brought to the fore. I'm very happy that the Interministerial Committee, led by the Deputy President, has been established, because this means that our views, the views of ordinary citizens, will, at the end of our 18-month-long process of dialogue, result in real, tangible policy changes.
It seems that behind the scenes, there is this attitude by many South Africans that it's time to get out of the system what you can, to have the mindset that you put yourself first as opposed to the people of South Africa, the ordinary people, those who really need it. Do you agree?
Yes, I do believe that, Mr. Robinson, and I'd written many an op-ed which has featured broadly on the media to say what BEE has done, sadly, is to create what's called a rent-seeking mentality. And we often find, and we mentioned some of these companies earlier that have been fronting BEE, and many of the patrons or owners or now beneficiaries of BEE that have been given ownership in these companies are people who've come from the struggle, and the rent-seeking mentality means that because we had sacrificed, we now deserve to eat. But the eating mentality is not going to work for South Africa. It's not going to benefit people on the ground. It's not going to create more efficient, productive industries. And it's only going to lead to real investment, like Starlink, for instance, completely being shying away from coming to South Africa because they view it as a feeding trough for the rich, and they don't want to be a part of this mess that we're in.
So how must we kickstart the process to actually come to a solution?
I think the national dialogue is one way of doing that. I think that public participation in general, as required by sections 59.1 and 72.1 of the Constitution, are necessary, but I'm disheartened to see that the South African public has not been publicly participating in legislation for too long. And for too long, we've had our rights relegated to 400 members of parliament, many of whom are co-opted by political parties to toe political party lines, which in essence just serve political party bosses or win political score points. The people of South Africa need to have their voices heard. A forum like the National Dialogue is one way of doing that. But in general, I think all people, and especially young people, must have a better understanding of what their rights are and a better assessment of their situation, not in terms of race, but in terms of socioeconomics. In plain terms, what I'm saying, Mr. Robinson, is it's not enough for us to blame the legacy of apartheid for everything. But what we should do, and especially as young people, is to assess where we are and how we got here over the last 30 years, and how do we take ownership of our future and come to some sort of solution that's to the benefit of all South Africans, not just some of us.
Well, are you optimistic?
I've always been an optimist. I've always tried to see the glass as being half full, and I believe in the power of young people to effect change. And I think that the youth have been doing a lot to indeed see change realized. Despite the odds, despite the high youth unemployment rates, we see young people shaking and breaking and making and doing absolutely creative things to innovate and kickstart the South African economy, number one, but also to redefine who they are as South African. I just want to say on that point that there are so many things, so many fig leaves that we could, or let me say low-lying fruits that we could get as young people that would just spur us into where we want to be. I mentioned Starlink earlier. Imagine the benefit of Starlink coming to South Africa, especially for young people. There's a whole digital economy that's waiting for us to tap into. There's digital learning, coding, AI that South Africans haven't been exposed to yet. It's a real shame that because of bad government decisions, people, and especially young people, have fallen so far from where they should be and are not able to compete with their peers around the world. So yes, I'm optimistic, but I think my optimism has been matched with a tinge of realism and pragmatism and a realization that something needs to be done and needs to be done soon.
It seems to me that the FW de Klerk Foundation is more active these days than before. Has there been a specific policy change within your organization that you say, well, listen, we're going to be actively involved in solutions?
Well, there have been a number of developments at the FW de Klerk Foundation. I think we've always been passively active and actively passive. And what that means is that we've always been very heavily involved in a number of spheres, be it the articles and op-eds that we post on social media, be it the communities that we go to and visit. But I want to say this, is that with the leadership change that has happened over the last year and a half now, with our new executive director, Christo van der Rede, coming in, we have really seen a real boom of productivity and innovation at the FW de Klerk Foundation. I serve as the manager of constitutional advancement. This is a program that did not exist before. And my job essentially means that I've got to go and advocate on what the Constitution is, specifically to the target audience being the youth. And in this regard, we've really broken in to the youth market. We go down to schools and universities. We create constitutional educational material for young people to learn because of what I've said, because it's important for the young people to really take a stance and to take that stance by understanding their rights, and especially their rights as it is protected by the Constitution. So the FW de Klerk Foundation, as I mentioned earlier, has always been very active. We will continue to be active, and we really enjoy being constitutional watchdogs, especially now under our Executive Director, Mr. van der Rede.
Ismail Joosub, thank you very much. Good luck and the best for your work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robinson. It has been a real pleasure being with you here today.
Thank you very much.